Hi, welcome to my channel Cloud with Girish. In this video, I will explain an important feature of AWS Lambda, Lambda Recursive Loop Configuration. Before July 2023, the only way to avoid recursive loop was carefully designing an event-driven architecture and thoroughly testing your applications to ensure that bugs didn't unintentionally cause recursive loops. These loops could lead to increased cost, degraded performance, and excessive resource consumption. In July 2023, AWS introduced Lambda Recursive Loop Configuration, providing a built-in mechanism to mitigate the risk of recursive loops. Let's review what a Lambda Recursive Loop is and explore an example of an event-driven architecture that can trigger this scenario. Let's look at our architecture. We have an SQS queue. This is a contact queue where contact data get dropped. This contact queue has an event mapping with a Lambda function. Lambda function has the code to process the new message, and then it's supposed to publish it to another destination queue. However, due to a bug, Lambda is publishing the message again to the contact queue. And now this will create a recursive loop because the publishing of a message in the contact queue is triggering the Lambda. Lambda is again putting the message back on the same contact queue, and then contact queue again invoking the Lambda. So it's a recursive loop scenario. So before we deep dive, let's look at some of the prerequisites. Need to be familiar with the AWS Management Console, since I will be using Management Console for the steps, the basic understanding of Lambda function, a basic understanding of the event-driven architecture, and a basic knowledge of Python programming. Let's get started. We're going to look at what Lambda Recursive Loop is, an example of recursive loop similar to how I explained in the architecture diagram. Lambda support, we will look at it, key points to consider, then we'll create a SQS queue, we'll create a Lambda function, and then I'll create an event mapping between the Lambda and SQS queue. I will trigger the event by publishing a message to SQS queue, and basically that will trigger the scenario that I was referring, that creating the recursive loop. And then we'll do the cleanup, deleting the Lambda function and SQS queue. So let's first look at what Lambda Recursive Loop is. A Lambda Recursive Loop refers to a scenario where a Lambda function is invoked recursively, creating a kind of infinite loop. Now it's similar to a do-while loop without an exit condition. So one event is triggering a second event, and that is again triggering the first one, right? So it's like a keep on going in a loop. In an event-driven architecture, this situation can arise when services like SQS and Lambda unintentionally invoke each other in a loop. For example, consider the following scenario. A message is published to an SQS queue. So in our architecture diagram, this queue was contact queue. Now this SQS queue is configured with an event trigger to invoke a Lambda function for processing. Now the Lambda function then publishing the message back to the same SQS queue. And this is basically due to a design flaw, code bug, or any other reason. But this is going to create a loop where the message continuously cycle between the queue and the Lambda function. Now, if this left unchecked, this recursive loop can consume your account allocated concurrency, leading to throttling and timeout. It will dry up the cost, and then it will negatively impact the other critical application functions by monopolizing the available resources, because now everything is being consumed by this recursive loop. Now, AWS announced the support for Lambda Recursive Loop Configuration in July 2023. This feature enables you to detect and prevent a recursive loop in your Lambda function. Now by default, this configuration is enabled for all accounts, ensuring that Lambda function automatically detect and stop infinite loop. Supported services as of January 2025 are simple queue service, simple notification service, and simple storage service. So SQS, SNS, and S3, of course, along with the Lambda, because that's how the event mapping will be created. Key point to consider when you are looking at Lambda recursive loop configuration. So first thing to know is that Lambda recursive loop configuration is enabled by default. So if your business use case requires disabling this feature, then make sure that you have alternative guardrail in place, such as you are monitoring the budget, you are monitoring the function invocation, you have like some CloudWatch alarms, because you are intentionally creating the recursive loop. With the detection and handling, Lambda detect recursive loop from the same event and then stop the invocation after it exceeds 16 attempts. So what that means is that even if it's on by default, the recursive loop will continue until it exceeds the 16 attempts, and then it will stop it. Now once it stops, then there are some notification and metrics that you can look at. So when a recursive loop is detected, AWS will send a notification to your account health dashboard under the other notification tab. And then an email is also sent to inform you of the detection. The point to consider is the email is sent once in 24 hours and it may take up to 3 hours to arrive. So like within that 24-hour window, if there is another recursive loop, then you will not get that email. And then of course, you can create your own notification by monitoring the metric. So there is a recursive invocation dropped, so you can monitor it. You can also monitor invocations and build your own notification mechanism, right? So all those options are there. So let's look at this scenario. I'm going to create a SQS queue. So this will be a standard queue and I will name it as contact queue. Contact information, including phone number and names in JSON format, will be published to this queue. Once a message is published, it will trigger a Lambda function for further processing. So I'm creating the console to create this function here. And as you can, to create the SQS queue, and then you have the queue name here, and then pretty much I'm leaving everything else as default. Now the use case for the Lambda function is to publish the contact information to another queue for final processing. However, in this scenario, I will intentionally publish the message back to the contact queue to simulate a recursive loop. So this is the queue where we will publish the message. It will then go to Lambda function and Lambda function will put it back on the same queue. So let's create the Lambda function. And again, I'm creating the Lambda function using the AWS management console. Of course, the function can be created using IAC approach like AWS SAM or any other mechanism. The function will be named contact example. So right here, and then I'm selecting the Python 3.13 as the runtime. Now this function code will process the messages from the contact queue, extract data element such as phone number and name from the message payload, and then it will perform the further processing. Now as part of this processing, the function will publish the message back to the contact queue, simulating a recursive loop. So now I have the queue and I have the Lambda function. So I need to create an event mapping, and this event mapping ensure that Lambda function is triggered whenever a contact is published to the contact queue. So I will add a trigger for this Lambda function and I'm going to say, hey, map it with the SQS queue. So few things we need to ensure is that Lambda function has the necessary permission to publish the message to contact queue. Otherwise you will get an error. And then Lambda function has recursive loop termination enabled. Now this configuration is enabled by default, but it's a good practice to verify it, right? So in this case, you can go to the configuration tab and look at the recursive loop detection configuration, and it should say that, hey, terminate it, right? So there are two options you have, terminate or allow. So by default it's terminate. I'm going to leave it at that value. And now I got the SQS queue, I got the Lambda function, I have created an event mapping. So now I'm going to go back to my SQS queue and I'm going to publish the message. By publishing this message, it will basically SQS queue, because of the event mapping, will trigger the Lambda function, and then Lambda function gonna publish it back to SQS, and that's how it becomes the recursive loop. So once it's recursive loop is detected, like I stated before, you will be notified through the AWS Health dashboard via email. So this is how the dashboard looks like, right? If you go in your dashboard, the health dashboard, you will see a notification on the other notification tab, and it will notify you that a recursive loop has been detected. And then same thing for email. You will also get an email. There may be some delay in the email, but email will be sent to the account owner notifying that a recursive loop has been detected. And this is how the email look like, right? It will say, hey, AWS Lambda has detected that one or more Lambda functions in your AWS account, so and so, and there is a recursive loop, and then it will tell you what do I need to do, review this and look at your design and so on. Now these are the two examples of notification. Like I said, in addition to these, you can set up your own, right? Custom monitoring. You can monitor the Lambda function invocation. You can also monitor the recursive invocation drop metric, and that way you can have your own view and notifications. And then once we're done with it, then just you ensure that Lambda function is deleted to avoid any unnecessary resource usage, and also delete the SQS queue. Now, if you created any new role during the process, remember to delete that as well. So in this workshop, I demonstrated how to validate a Lambda recursive loop configuration. I used a SQS queue and Lambda function event mapping to create a recursive invocation scenario. The entire configuration and validation steps, including the creation and setup of the SQS queue and Lambda function, were done using the AWS Management Console. Again, the use case for this workshop was to explain architecture of like how the recursive loop will be created, and that's why like it doesn't have a whole lot of code, rather like showing that how you trigger it through SQS, invoke the Lambda put the message back on the same SQS, and then you creating the recursive loop. And then there is a configuration in the Lambda function where you can control that recursive loop need to terminate or it need to allow, right? So I hope you found this tutorial both helpful and informative. I'm constantly working on new content covering various AWS topics. So please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the Cloud with Girish channel. Your support helps me continue creating valuable AWS tutorials and workshops. Stay tuned for more exciting content. Thank you.